Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really awesome guest involved in creating a better tomorrow for millions of people out there. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Lily Brown, who is Assistant Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and Director at the Center for the Treatment and Study of Anxiety, Perelman School of Medicine, down the street here at University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Brown received her bachelor's degree in psychology at Drexel University, then went on to do her doctoral degree in clinical psychology and learning and behavior psychology at UCLA. In graduate school, Dr. Brown researched the mechanisms of change and fear conditioning and extinction, with a particular focus on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in the Anxiety and Depression Research Center. She completed her pre-doc internship at Brown University in the Psychosocial Research Department there, completing research on the rate of suicidal behaviors in patients with PTSD. And her current research focuses on treatment development and implementation to mitigate suicide risk in patients with anxiety disorders and PTSD, and specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety disorders, including exposure and response prevention for OCD, and has also been trained in the treatment of borderline personality disorders. A lot of really interesting topics that we don't normally get into on the show. Honored to have with us today Dr. Lily Brown. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Having you. Would love to start off by handing you the floor for a little bit to talk a little bit more about you and sort of researching your background. I saw all sorts of cool things that you were doing well before you even got your PhD, doing work with children with autism spectrum disorder, working in the Anxiety Research Center at Drexel, also at some really cool DARPA-funded shop doing augmented cognition research. Tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit of what got you into psychology.
Sounds great. Yeah, I grew up in Palmyra, New Jersey, and families from the South Jersey area originally. Lots of aunts and uncles in the greater Philadelphia area. My mom grew up in West Philly, my dad grew up in New Jersey, and so Philadelphia was always the place that I wanted to be. And we moved when I was little, devastatingly. We moved and had to adapt. And I think that's actually one of the things that sort of took me on a journey towards psychology, was understanding how important connection to other people is. And also, just being really curious about in groups and out groups and trying to figure all of that out, which I think eventually took me down the road to clinical psychology. So then I grew up in Maryland and went to high school there and quickly left to come back to Philadelphia, where I feel like it's always most resonated with my personality. And I've been so happy to be back. I've been back now for about 8 years. And yeah, I've been a little bit of a jack of all trades initially in psychology to try to figure out what I was most drawn to, what I was good at. What's so interesting about our field in mental health is there is such a wide range of opportunities. I knew that I was really interested in trying to figure out, why we do the things we do and how to help all of us to make behavior changes in a way that's sustainable. I knew that that was sort of always my driving force in the mental health world, but obviously that applies to so many different things. That could apply to anxiety disorders and suicide prevention, which is where most of my work is these days. But I learned quite a bit about working with kids on the autism spectrum. I worked in a group where we were doing Lego therapy and helping kids with learning how to socialize with one another through play, basically. And then I ended up working in a lab at Drexel, mostly focused on social anxiety disorder and a bit about physical activity and trying to help people become more physically active if they wanted to. Then I was really lucky to get a position out after college working in a psychiatric hospital where I was doing research and trying to understand the transition out of psychiatric hospitalization, which we know can be a high risk time for suicide. And so the mentors that I had there provided amazing foundational knowledge in working with folks who are probably at the worst point of their lives. And that was an eye-opening experience for me. Then I ended up at grad school, and I knew that I wanted to create a niche for myself around the anxiety and suicide prevention world. And there weren't a lot of people at that intersection. There were expert anxiety disorder researchers, and there were expert suicidologists. But for the most part, the two worlds were pretty different, and there wasn't a lot of overlap and crosstalk between them, which to a person not in mental health might seem weird, but in the mental health field, we tend to be pretty siloed. And so my vision was I want to get expert training in being an anxiety disorder, researcher, and expert training in how to take what we know about suicide prevention and make it even more effective. And I want to do both. And so that's most of what my career focuses on these days.
And before we get deeper into the topics of anxiety, everything going on at CTSA, there's a couple things just because again, as I mentioned in the intro to the show, we don't normally touch on these topics, and I realize a couple of these things I'm going to ask you is probably an entire semester of something that would be taught. But a couple places I'd like to go first. One is to a really interesting paper you wrote back in 2011. This was in Behavior Modification, 2011 March, where you're talking about sort of the different waves that have occurred over the last, I guess, several decades in the area of cognitive behavioral therapies. At the time, sort of focusing on here in 2011, the third wave with the different tools like dialectic behavior therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about sort of the waves, sort of a little bit of a summary of where we've been and sort of maybe where we are in 2024 in terms of maybe a fourth wave or not yet a fourth wave?
Yeah, the wheels of change in mental health clinical work move slowly. So I don't think we're that much further along compared to where we were back then. Yeah, at that time, there was a lot of really interesting work happening around trying to improve response rates to therapy because we had decades of research by that point showing that certain kinds of therapies were really, really helpful for a variety of conditions. A lot of people who get, for instance, behavioral therapy for anxiety disorders, they really benefit tremendously, but not everybody. A lot of people who get cognitive therapy principles for depression benefit, but not everybody. And so there was a mad dash in the late 90s and the early 2000s to try to figure out what could we do to make treatments even more effective. And there were a lot of these horse race studies comparing treatment 1 to treatment 2 for X condition, whether it's anxiety disorders, anorexia, depression, you name it. And so they were talking in those days about initially a lot of interest in behavioral therapy and trying to understand principles of behaviorism and how that relates to why we make the decisions that we make. And, thinking of it, one way to think of it is we are all, to some extent, a product of our consequences. The things that we do that get reinforced, we tend to keep doing. And the things that we do that we get punished for, we tend to do less of. And so behaviorism in psychotherapy is all about understanding who we are in relation to our context and principles of reinforcement and punishment. Then there was cognitive behavioral therapy, where we were thinking about how we are more than just principles of reinforcement, that there are these intervening factors, which are our interpretations. That is, it's not just what happens to us, but it's what we think about what happens to us that dictates our emotional reaction. And so cognitive behavioral therapy was focused on trying to, yes, change our behavior and create new behavioral principles, and also to change the way that we respond to our thinking patterns, and trying to look at how our knee-jerk interpretations guide our emotional reactions. And then the third wave was focused on a little bit of a different approach in exploring more mindfulness-based principles, with the idea there being we can appreciate that principles of behaviorism are at play, that what we get reinforced for we'll probably keep doing, and also that the way that we interpret situations does dictate how we feel. And yet there might be different ways to change our emotional reactions that other than directly trying to change how we're thinking. So for instance, with mindfulness, the goal is to get more distance from our thinking, to recognize our thinking as just thinking, to create more space between our knee-jerk reactions and our behaviors, and to try to give permission to feel whatever you need to feel and think whatever you need to think in a given moment, without letting it be the deciding factor in terms of what we do. So those were some of the more recent waves of psychotherapy, knowing that predating all of that, there were all kinds of interesting things happening in the world of psychotherapy development. I'm sure you know about some of them. Some of them I don't even know very much about. It was a wild ride to get to this point. We've learned a lot, but we still do have a lot more to learn.
Appreciate laying the groundwork there. And then a couple of years later, come 2016, you do your dissertation. This is entitled "Improving Human Reactivity to Trauma Exposure Using Affect Labeling." Again, I won't have you go into the whole story here, but it basically, you're involved in creating this sort of this computerized training method that is, well, I guess a method that it previously existed. You've computerized it, using this concept of affect labeling, about putting feelings into words. And one of the things I heard you talk about, I've watched a couple of presentations that you gave over the years, this principle of phenotyping, digital phenotyping, or fingerprinting some of these conditions like PTSD. I'm not sure if that's directly related, but if you could say a couple words about that as well, and then we'll slowly but surely transition into to what's happening at Penn.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, so the concept of digital phenotyping is exactly what you described. It's this idea of trying to get a better understanding of what is happening for a given person at a given point in time that helps us to predict positive and negative outcomes. So, for example, some of the work that we do is in trying to better understand the relationship between sleep and mood, with the idea being, on a given night, if one of the patients that we're working with has a bad night of sleep, what might we predict the next day in terms of an exacerbation in things like PTSD symptoms, or an exacerbation in suicidal crises? And it's not enough to look at group level effects, because what we know from some of my research and others is that when you sometimes collapse across everybody and trying to understand prediction of bad outcomes, you lose a lot of important information. And I think sleep is a good example of this. For some people, you have a bad night of sleep, and the next day, your whole day is off. It's harder to pay attention. Your mood takes, a toll. Maybe you're using substances to help yourself feel more awake. Maybe some of those are problematic for you, maybe not. For other people, they have a bad night of sleep and it's par for the course for them. And they feel like this is maybe the norm for them. It's not something especially notable, and it doesn't have that big of an impact. And the question I'm interested in is, why is that? Why are some of us so different? And how can we use information about an individual to help us better understand their unique risk profiles? I'm especially interested in that as it relates to suicide risk, the idea being there aren't high risk people and low risk people for suicide. We sometimes, as clinicians, we like to think that that's the case, that you can easily divide people into these groups. It kind of helps you sleep better at night, saying that's a low risk person or that's a high risk person, and I know what I know to be on edge about it. But it's not that way. And intuitively, I think this makes sense. risk fluctuates really dramatically. And so with digital phenotyping, the goal is to say, well, when someone recently had a perturbation in their state, a bounce away from a baseline to a negative place where they were having a lot of suicidal urges, for instance, what happened right before? And is it really right before that we need to look at, or is it actually the week leading up to that to get a better picture of predicting risk so that we can develop tools to intervene and reduce risk down the road?
Excellent. All right. Again, I thank you for laying the groundwork there. Now, let's now segue to your role as director of CTSA, Center for the Treatment of Study of Anxiety, down the street here at Penn. And I'd love to start off with just this. I mean, this was World Health Organization. I know there's CDC data as well, but it looks like globally about 5% of us are affected by one of the several anxiety disorders that are in the basket that CTSA focuses on, from OCD to PTSD, social phobia and panic, and a range of other ones. How have we gotten here? I mean, with somebody that specializes in this space, that has been involved in it. I mean, 300 million. I mean, we always compare things, sort of, we talk about pandemics. Wow, we have a pandemic and this and that. This is major. Just at looking at these numbers, how have we gotten here? And what is sort of in the, when you get together with other people that specialize in this space, what's your typical assessment of, I guess, the world and its level of anxiety and stress, or whatever the basket you put it in?
That's a great question. I think it's also $1 million question. And I think most of the people in my field have their own explanations about why this is the way that it is. I think the reality is it's a combination of things. For one, we're doing a much better job than we ever have at actually assessing the presence and absence of mental health symptoms. We've seen over the past decade a huge expansion in asking about mental health symptoms across the entire health system, in primary care and OBGYN clinic visits. My dentist asks me if I'm depressed. I think it's great, but that also means that we're going to see we are detecting rates of anxiety disorders and depression more readily, which is a good thing, because in order to design a system that's able to respond to the need, we need to know what the need really is. So I think one part of it is we have more awareness of mental health than we ever have. I think we saw a huge interest in mental health during the pandemic. And it's been fascinating as a person in mental health during this time to see a huge increase in the number of people reaching out for consultation and questions, and journalists asking for interviews about mental health at the height of the pandemic. And then I have seen that trickle back down. There was a time when it was very in vogue to be interested in mental health. And I think interest alone doesn't do much to solve the problem. When you look at, worldwide spending on mental health, the most recent statistic I saw was a couple of years ago, but it was something like 2% of the worldwide healthcare budget goes toward mental health. So it was a time when people were really interested in mental health, and yet access to care is a real challenge. So that's another piece of the puzzle, is that people who are struggling have a really hard time getting connected to evidence-based practices for mental health. Wait lists are really long for therapy, and sometimes people finally muster up the courage to reach out and ask for help. And when they hear that there's a long wait list, they get discouraged and they never come back again. Of course, there are also social factors that are related to the development of anxiety disorders and depression. There are some studies showing that for some people, increased engagement with social media is associated with poor mental health outcomes. That's particularly true among, for instance, adolescents. There's been some research on this as it relates to eating disorder symptoms, body satisfaction, and anxiety. And to me, this is not terribly surprising that the more people get sucked into a social media world, the more they're comparing themselves to other people. It makes sense. The more, dissatisfied they might feel, as comparison is the thief of joy, right? The other piece is there is so much pressure on so many people. I get requests from patients constantly, our center does, from people who never reached out for therapy before, but they're feeling like they're at a breaking point. expectations changed for many people during the pandemic. Many of us went from a high workload before the pandemic to an even higher workload in the middle, and then, in the long-term aftermath of the pandemic. A virtual world has made it really hard to contain boundaries between work and home. And people are connected to their work in ways that are often not helpful for them in the long run. And so finding a way to get connected to your work in a way that's not draining, I think, is the goal for many people these days. Those are just some of the factors that I see as related to our, increased prevalence rates of anxiety disorders. I'm sure there's much more to it than that, but those are some of the things that are at the top of mind for me.
That's why we have a Center for the Treatment of Study of Anxiety. You are the director of the organization. Could you just, talk a little bit about, how you arrived there, were recruited for this important role, where you are, and a little bit about, I know that you have quite a broad staff in terms of a clinical staff. You have pre-docs, postdocs, a variety of research assistants and community projects going on. Talk a little bit about sort of your typical day. Clearly, I mentioned before you're balancing quite a bit of what makes up that basket of anxiety disorders. But walk us and take a little time on this to go through the center.
Sure. Yeah, our center, we really have three core missions. One is the delivery of clinical care to patients across the lifespan. So we treat children, adolescents, adults, older adults with a wide variety of anxiety-related disorders, including OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which, by the way, are no longer technically considered anxiety disorders, but they are a major focus of the services that we provide at our center. We also have a huge training mission. So we have in-house trainees, like you mentioned, who are amazing and so skillful at what they do. And then we also train folks across the world, especially in a virtual environment. It's gotten easier than ever to do trainings. And most of that was spearheaded initially by our former director, Dr. Edna Foa. She developed two gold standard treatments for anxiety disorders. The first is prolonged exposure therapy for PTSD, and she also developed exposure and response prevention for OCD. And our group leads regular trainings for other therapists in how to do these evidence-based therapies. I took over as the center director in 2019. I had been here at Penn for 3 years before that. And when I took over, it was a major mission of mine to expand our training initiatives. The pandemic happened 4 months later. And in many ways, the opportunity for expansion of training became easier than ever because it was more feasible for folks to come to a virtual training than it ever would to come in person. So now we do trainings in suicide risk assessment, in treating social anxiety disorder, treating panic disorder, treating generalized anxiety disorder. We have child psychologists who provide workshops in treating child anxiety and helping parents who have kids who are anxious. A huge training initiative. And then the third piece of what we do is our research mission. So we have a variety of different studies, some of which are mine, some of which are my colleagues' studies, some of which Dr. Foa still leads here at our center, focus on a wide variety of topics. For instance, I have a grant right now looking at a way to use a type of brain stimulation called transcranial magnetic stimulation to try to promote learning when patients who've been exposed to a trauma are needing to learn not to be afraid of the memory of the trauma itself. And that actually builds off of some of the dissertation work that you mentioned before. So folks listen to a narrative of their trauma memory, and in between iterations of that, we deliver either real or sham brain stimulation to see whether we can help with optimal learning. So we have other studies focused on enhancing treatment outcome for OCD, some that are focused on suicide prevention. We have a pretty wide range of areas of focus in our group, and community partnerships too.
Yep.
So Dr. Foa really was a trailblazer in establishing these amazing community partnerships. So we go into community mental health centers across the city and provide trainings in how to do best practice gold standard work with survivors of trauma. It's really rewarding and reinforcing work.
As you were just mentioning that the one study, and again, we can put a link to all this in the bio of the show in terms of PTSD and the transcranial stimulation and all that is there on the website, and it's interesting because it talks about the clinical interview, brain scans, and then either a real or a sham stimulation event. Could you say a couple more words about it? I thought this was quite interesting when I was reading through this. I said the first one you come to, I figured it was yours. But the only other time that we talked about transcranial brain stimulation on the show was actually with the United States Air Force, where they were using the technology to actually enhance a pilot's ability to sort of learn how to fly a plane, which is kind of
Cool.
interesting. Would love to sort of, again, going back to your digital phenotyping, principle and all that, a little bit of what's happening in this study. If you could just sort of walk through a little bit of what you'll be learning in this content. I think it's really cool sounding.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you mentioned this in the intro. My second job. My first job was as an ice cream scoop. I
Nice.
was terrible at it.
I
I had
love
like
ice cream.
carpal tunnel for my life for my scooping ice cream. My second job was with I was a contractor with the
Yeah,
with the Department of Defense and
yeah.
the Navy, and we were doing a study looking at trying to design a smart suit to prevent pilots from losing consciousness with high G forces. And that was my introduction into like human factors research and psychology. So anytime, and we have some studies now that are funded by the Department of Defense, focused on different things. No brain stimulation studies with them. So I'm excited to hear about what you learned. I'll check out that podcast. So yeah, our study, it's based on this idea that when a person goes through a trauma, one thing that we reliably see is that there is this disruption in the ability to learn that things which are objectively safe are safe. And what tends to happen when someone's been through a trauma is that their threat detection system gets totally disrupted. And that can go in both directions. Things that are objectively unsafe, some survivors of trauma their brains don't code unsafe things as unsafe. Conversely, sometimes it goes in the direction that things that are objectively safe feel really dangerous. And this is a pretty reliable finding across all different labs showing this deficit in the ability to correctly code things as safe or not. And we often have experimental models for this that look at what we call fear conditioning and extinction. So we can, in the laboratory, design an experiment where someone learns to be afraid of something. For instance, we're not doing this in this particular study, but you might have a shape that comes on the screen and pair it with, an uncomfortable electric shock. And then sure enough, the next time that shape's on the screen, the person goes, oh no, I'm going to get shocked. And then they get shocked. And then the next time the image comes on the screen, they go, oh no, I'm going to get shocked. And even if they don't get shocked anymore, they've learned to be afraid of that shape through this concept called Pavlovian conditioning. Extinction learning is, what if we present that shape again and again and again and again? How long does it take for the person to decide that that shape is no longer threatening? It's not unlearning that happens in extinction. It's learning about safety when something used to be threatening. It's an important distinction that we've learned about over the past few decades. Anyway, so flashing forward to our study. In our study, survivors of trauma often code the memory of the trauma itself as dangerous. When someone has PTSD, they will have intrusive memories of the trauma. They'll be going about their day-to-day life, taking care of their children, at work, on the bus, and they'll have these moments where the memory flashes into their brain. And sometimes that's because something in the environment cued a memory. Maybe someone looks like a perpetrator. Maybe they had an emotional reaction and that felt similar to what they felt during the trauma. Maybe there's a thought that they had which reminded them of what happened. And the memory of the trauma itself is really uncomfortable and horrible. And so the natural reaction is to try not to think about it, to try to suppress it, try to get rid of it, try to distract yourself. And the more you try not to think of it, the worse it gets, and the more intense the emotional reactions to the memory gets. So what we're interested in doing is finding a way to help survivors with PTSD learn about their ability to sit with and tolerate the memory of the trauma so that it loses its potency, it loses its stickiness, and it loses its grip over you. And so the way that we do that is, one way that we can do that is we can have folks write a personalized description of what happened to them in the trauma. And then we turn it into an audio recording and we have them listen to it. And as they're listening to it, we measure their physiological reactions. That is a procedure that we call script-driven imagery that was developed at in Boston, I'm pretty sure at MGH in the mid-90s. What we're interested in doing is adding on top of this procedure, this brain stimulation to try to help promote learning. And the rationale behind it is some people are so terrified of the memory of the trauma that they will do whatever they can to not really engage with it, to distract themselves, think about other things, not really pay much attention. And when you're measuring their physiology, they might even look not very upset. And it might be confusing because you would expect that this difficult memory maybe should be upsetting. And so they're kind of underengaged with the memory. Other people are at the opposite end of the spectrum, where they are extremely upset when they're listening to the memory. And they're so upset that they can't really learn much. The brain stimulation is targeting a region of the brain called the intraparietal sulcus, IPS. And it's a region of the brain that my colleague Nick Balderson has done some research on that is tied to arousal, your ability to modulate your arousal system. And so we're delivering brain stimulation to this region of the brain to try to help folks who are at the high level of arousal come back down, and folks who are really scared about listening to the script feel more confident that they can do it so that they can both learn, coming regardless of what end of the spectrum that they're coming from. So that's, in a nutshell, the goal of that study.
It's amazing. It's just so cool again to see how some of these technologies, like the transcranial stimulation, are being leveraged together with cognitive behavioral work and into these new protocols. And so I appreciate you walking through that. And again, we'll link to that in the bio of the show. But I wanted the audience to get an appreciation for sort of the combinatorial nature of some of the things that you're putting together here in these evidence-based protocols. Let's talk a little bit because we're going to talk about PTSD, but obviously you also specialize in the connection as you mentioned early on between PTSD and suicide. And again, this is an area that you've published quite extensively in, not just PTSD, but sort of suicide, self-harm in a range of conditions, everything from patients living with HIV, inflammatory bowel disease, issues in terms of adult sexual and gender issues, opioid abuse. Again, you come at this whichever angle is, and again, I've watched a couple of your presentations on this topic, and they can, I guess, take up a semester. Walk us through sort of where we are in terms of some of the tools, where are the unmet needs, and a little bit of what's happening at the center in terms of sort of this anxiety suicide intersection.
Yeah. Well, we know a lot more now than we did 2 decades ago.
Okay.
There are some interventions, some treatments that are known to be very helpful at reducing risk for future suicide attempts. Some of those include an intervention called the safety planning intervention, which was developed by Greg Brown, also here at Penn, no relation. I always say because we collaborate, I'm very lucky to collaborate a bit with Greg, and we're not related though, that would be cool. And Barbara Stanley, who passed away recently from Columbia University. They developed this intervention called the safety planning intervention. And it's genius in its simplicity. The basic idea is helping a person to anticipate a future suicidal crisis. So the thinking is, if you've had a suicidal crisis in the past, there's a decent chance that in the future you might have another one. what could we do before the crisis happens to set you up so that you are prepared for that and so that you have an opportunity to keep yourself alive until the crisis passes. That's the goal of their intervention. And so we know that that's a really effective way to reduce risk for suicide attempts. We're interested in trying to find out more about how to help people use their safety plan when they're in crisis. And so one of the projects that I'm working on with a collaborator in the School of Nursing, his name's Jose Bauermeister, um, there's an Inspire Suicide Prevention Center grant that Penn received a few years ago. And Jose and I have a project that's focused on trying to help people who are a member of the LGBTQ plus community use their safety plan when they're in a crisis. And the thinking here is people who identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community are at higher risk for suicide. They're also at higher risk for trauma exposure for having PTSD. And we developed a mobile intervention and combined that with peer mentorship. So we basically gave folks who were randomized in this study, in the active arm, we gave them access to this mobile intervention that included skills for improving mental health, skills for improving professional development related to getting your first job, dating advice, strategies for kind of life skills. And we supplemented that with peer mentor sessions. And every time the peer mentor checks in with the participant, we're always asking, have you used your safety plan? Have you used your safety plan? Have you used your safety plan? As kind of gentle nudges to make sure that people have that in the back of their mind, ready to go the next time that they're in crisis. And we just last week wrapped up our final assessment for that study. So we'll have data coming very, very soon to show whether our intervention actually helped people to use their safety plan more often. The thinking being, if we know that safety planning helps, how can we get people to use their safety planning more frequently? That's the idea in that study. And in particular for that study, we're trying to target things like social connection, increasing confidence about the ability to cope with discrimination, and trying to help people find ways to really build a life worth living and boost their positive emotional experiences too. So that's one of the projects that we're doing. We have a variety of other related projects, which are, I think, reflective of where we're at in the field of suicidology right now, which is we have some interventions that work really well, but they are not being used very often in real world clinical practice. And sometimes the way that they're used is not optimal. And so my team at my center and at Penn in general, we're focused on trying to understand how can we help clinicians to use these tools? How can we make sure that the way that they're doing it is with best practices in mind? And also, what is next to better improve outcomes and to try to make a better impact on, the public health significance of suicide, which is very significant right now, as you may know.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in one of your presentations that it's I think the 10th leading cause of death around the world nowadays. So that's, a shocking figure as well. No, I appreciate that you sharing that and everything you're doing on that front. Um, you know, it's interesting. One of the themes that's been kind of hot for us in recent months, especially I guess well, last couple of years with COVID, has been this concept of One Health, and this theme that our health as human beings is really integrally connected to all the animals and the so-called shared environment on this planet. And usually when we think about things like climate change, we think, okay, this climate change affects these insects, which affect what these animals eat, and so forth and so on. And we get a pandemic, unfortunately, infectious disease pandemic. You wrote this really interesting piece a couple of months ago in JAMA Insights on the connection between climate change and mental health. And I'd really be interested in seeing what, if you could talk a little bit what you're experiencing at the center, and some of what you're learning in terms of the way the climate change and all the resulting things, whether it be heat waves, droughts, floods, and so forth, are affecting the health, the mental health of patients that you see on a daily basis.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you one example from a study that we did in 2016, I think, looking at exposures to natural disaster and how that affects suicide risk. So we had a study that was a population health study out of Chile, where they had done a series of assessments for PTSD symptoms, depression, suicide risk, etc. And then at a certain point thereafter, a natural disaster happened and caused major devastation to the community in Chile, and folks were reassessed. And one of the things that we learned was following this natural disaster, people who had pre-existing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder predating exposure to the natural disaster had an increase in suicidal thinking following the natural disaster. So exposure to climate crises alone don't necessarily tell us much in terms of the mental health impact. But when we look at personalized predictions, we learn a lot more. So not every trauma affects folks the same way. And certain people come into a trauma with lived experience that significantly changes their interpretation and their sense of ability to be resilient following a natural disaster. And PTSD is one example. So what we're taking away from that is, we know that a lot of people are anecdotally, and there's increasing research on this. A lot of people are struggling with climate anxiety. And there's been a lot of interest in what to do about that. And there was a climate conference here at Penn, I think in February, where we were talking about just that. There's very little research on interventions to address climate anxiety. And I think that's actually appropriate because some of the climate scientists who were at this conference were saying, this is not an individual level problem, that, that's sort of, addressing one piece. It's the tip of the glacier, if you will, that people are anxious about climate change, and the anxiety isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is what's happening to contribute to the climate change. And I think that that's true. I also think that there are some people who they're faced with the impact of climate disasters much more than the rest of us, based on the zip code in which they live. Even within Philadelphia, we know that there are certain zip codes that flood much more readily when we have big storms. And then when you take a global perspective, of course, there's great variability in the impact of climate disaster on the basis of income and how much that can protect you. So I think among the individuals who are noticing that their climate anxiety is affecting their ability to focus on what really matters to them, I do think we need to learn more about what to do to help them. So for instance, people who are paralyzed by climate anxiety so that they can't do their job, they can't focus on raising their children, they can't focus in school. We can't just let that live and say, oh, well, yeah, it makes sense that you're anxious. Good luck to you. We need to figure out what to do to help them, but it needs to be based in the reality of a changing climate, and not promoting toxic positivity and just saying, oh, I'm sure it'll just be fine. But realistically, with life being what it is, what things are in your control that are going to help you move in a direction that matters to you, knowing that you might not have any impact on what's going to happen in terms of the climate, and yet you have impact on your day-to-day life. What can we do to get you focused on things that matter to you? We'll be curious to see where things go in the future. There's very little intervention research right now. It's a little bit of a controversial topic, actually.
It's here. So again, I'm glad you're at the center and you're thinking about it, and talking with thought leaders of how we can potentially address this as it becomes, I guess, hopefully climate anxiety isn't overtaking us too much, but yeah, it's nice to see it there in your work. One other one I just have to, you mentioned this earlier on, in that the center does work with children, and CHOP is down the street as well. A couple of weeks ago, I had the Dr. Ashwin Vasan, who's the commissioner of health in New York City, on the show, and he talks about social media as this digital toxin for our children. And clearly, I guess we don't know the repercussions of how the youngsters nowadays are going to, evolve, change, whatever. But, I try to keep my kids, the proper balance there. But if you could talk just a little bit about what you're seeing, and in terms of the social media situation, and especially on the younger folks, and any interesting anecdotes, stories related to the center, I think that'd be really interesting as well.
Yeah, there was actually a huge call for more research on social media and mental health from that National Institute of Mental Health about a year and a half ago. And part of the motivation for them trying to fund a lot of research in this area is that there's not nearly enough actual concrete empirical data on this. We're starting to get more data on this topic. But we know social media is not going away. We know that. Even if we show that social media is categorically harmful, convincing people not to use it seems completely unrealistic to me. And so I think the future of where we need to be headed in this landscape is, what can we do to make social media less harmful and more healthy? That might look like um, helping adolescents to decide for themselves on deciding their own limits for social media, helping coach them toward engaging with content that has a positive impact on how they feel about themselves, helping them build more awareness about the effect of certain kinds of media engagement on how they feel, and not restricting their choices. I don't think that that's going to be a especially helpful strategy, because what I know about adolescents is whatever you tell them not to do, they're going to want to do it even more. But helping people to, in their freedom to choose, build insight into what's helpful and healthy for them down the road. How best to do that, we're not totally sure. But we actually were really interested in the idea. We put together an application. It wasn't funded. I wish it was, because I thought it was such a cool idea to think about harnessing the good energy that's out there in social media to help people do hard things. And so in our center, a lot of the therapy that we do is focused on exposure therapy, like helping to approach your fears and do things that are scary. And intellectually, people tend to get it. They're like, yes, I need to do that thing. That makes sense to me. But emotionally, it's really hard and I don't want to. And I'm tired and I can't take any more stress today. And so emotionally, there's all sorts of reasons why people don't do their exposure therapy homework. And so we were thinking, could we collate social media, have a social media kind of library of examples of people with success stories from exposure therapy. And so we started pulling together this resource of a ton of videos all across social media of adolescents and how they're actually doing exposure therapy. Some of them are coached by a therapist to do practice, some are just doing it on their own. And there are so many positive examples of people using social media to celebrate their successes as it relates to approaching anxiety. And I think that's a really encouraging sign. How do we get people to engage with that content is a question that I'm really interested in.
So it's an interesting approach. I haven't really thought of it from that perspective. But yeah, hey, and I'm sure if anyone can figure out, your team will. So no, that's really, really interesting. Um, what can you tell us about the Peace Project, prolonged exposure to address community violence, happening here in Philly, treating individuals that have experienced or witnessed community or gun violence, another major societal issue.
Yeah. This project is led by Sandy Capaldi in my group, and she has developed a team to provide training to clinicians who provide care to survivors with PTSD. So the idea is Ed Nafoa always says that most clinicians feel like they know how to treat PTSD. And it might be that they're using evidence-based practices. And often that doesn't mean that they're using evidence-based practices. And so the idea behind this project is, what if we support people who are already working with survivors with PTSD and train them in how to do evidence-based practices and then compensate them for actually implementing the practice. So Sandy's organized a series of trainings and workshops for folks to come to. We have these 4-day workshops where folks come and learn all about evidence-based therapy for PTSD. Then folks can get additional hands-on consultation where we actually watch their videotapes of them providing therapy to patients with PTSD and give them feedback about how to enhance the efficacy of what they're doing. Relatedly, at the same time that Sandy got funding for that project, my colleague Eleanor Kaufman over in the trauma unit of Penn Presbyterian Hospital got funding to implement therapy for survivors of violence through the same funding mechanism from the state of Pennsylvania. And there, Eleanor and myself and a team of therapists are working on for people who are hospitalized following an act of violence. Most frequently, that means a survivor of a firearm violence. Sometimes it's other kinds of violence. Can we get them connected to therapy while they're still here medically hospitalized? And does that help them in staying connected to therapy when they leave? So we have these 2 projects that are really focused around trying to be responsive to the needs of our community here in Philadelphia related to PTSD and trauma.
Outstanding, really outstanding work. Um, did I miss anything? It's such an amazing portfolio. If I missed anything that you want to mention in the center's portfolio initiatives, please. At the same time, we're sort of getting to the second part of 2024 now. Any upcoming initiatives, public-facing stuff that we should know about in terms of the center, in terms of you, conferences, talks you're going to be giving, places that we could possibly run into you and meet you? Anything else that I missed? Please take the floor.
The only thing I can think of right now is we have a brand new project that's starting next month that's funded by the Department of Defense, and it's going to be looking at ways to help soldiers in the Connecticut Army National Guard get connected to best practices for suicide prevention. And I can't say too much about it yet because it's just about to start, but we're really excited about the announcement that we did get that funding to help. I mean, I can't think of anyone more deserving of help and support than service members, and the National Guard service members are really, really deserving of extra support and help. They have a tremendous role that they play in our community. And so we're really excited to get to be involved. That's a partnered project with Yale University and the Connecticut Army National Guard. So that'll be on the horizon soon. It's just about to start. We always have new things coming down the pipeline. Our group will be at a conference in November here in Philly. It's the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy. And we, love to catch up with anybody who's interested in our work. And we're really grateful to you for your interest.
Awesome. Really awesome. And we will put, again, a lot of these links to what, some of these topics we talked about in the bio of the show. It really, I'm excited listening to you, Dr. Brown, talk about these initiatives. I really wish you and the center the best with all of these programs, the various clinical studies that you're going to be doing as you move them forward, and equally excited to know that it's happening all here in Philadelphia. So this has been really great. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode of our show across the various podcast networks, or who will be watching on our YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Dr. Lily Brown, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and Director of the Center for the Treatment and Study of Anxiety, Perelman School of Medicine, University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Brown, I really want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk to us today and take us through everything you're up to. Obviously, thank you for all you do for this situation of anxiety that we find ourselves in 2024. And as we'd like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for millions of patients out there via what you're doing. Really a great story, and I look forward to staying in touch and following up next year.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor. I really appreciate your time.
Great having you today.